Everyone, after last history class that I gave, I guess it was, 3 or 4 weeks ago, someone asked if I could recommend a single volume, for Jewish history. So I brought over here my copy of Crash Course in Jewish History, which is, like I said, it's more of a traditional perspective, and I think it's a fantastic book. I use it a lot for more of a kind of a Christian or more of a secular perspective, secular versus Jewish. I would recommend A History of the Jews by Paul Johnson. Today we are going to be talking about basically from the death of Alexander till the destruction of the Second Temple. So we're going to cover it, and if we get sidetracked, we'll just skip because we're going to finish it. Okay, that's the plan. And in this time period, we're going to meet the preeminent Jewish Roman historian by the name of Josephus. Everyone heard the name Josephus? Mm-hmm. Flavius Josephus. So he was Jewish, and he was actually in charge of the resistance in the Galilee during the Great Revolt. So he was basically a Jewish general in northern Israel during the time of the Great Revolt, about the year 66 through the year 73 of the Common Era. And he gave up resistance, and he joined the Romans, and eventually he started off as a translator. He became the official chronicler, or chronicler, is that a word? I don't know if that's a word. Chronicler of the Roman. He would go around with the Romans. He became a member of the Roman royalty, even though it seems that he remained true to Judaism. He was a practicing Jew throughout for the rest of his life. But he's indispensable for the study of this time period. He wrote these amazing books with so many details, highly recommended. His 3 major books are Antiquities, we call it kinds of Jewish history, the Jewish Wars, and Contra Appian. Contra Appian was a kind of a debate between, there was this massive ideological debate with this guy named Appian, and it was Contra Appian, it was against this guy Appian. And a lot of what we're going to be discussing today is obviously from Josephus, which is, and he's a good source because, he's contemporary. He was there, he lived it, so which is, it's historical for a lot of what we're going to talk about, but also because he's not necessarily everyone's biased. That all historians are biased. Everyone has their slant, but he kind of has a representation from the Jewish perspective, but also from the Roman perspective, and so he's considered very trustworthy with regards to ancient historians. Okay, so we left off last time. We're talking about the great Greek Empire and the great conquest, 10 years of Alexander. So this guy, Alexander, this young, energetic general, he takes over an empire, which, it wasn't really an empire. It was a kingdom of his dad, Philip. He probably assassinated him. And he begins this decade of conquest, and he just keeps on going further and further. Never lost a battle. He ends up in India, as far east as India, capturing everything in his way. Never lost a battle. And there is mutiny amongst the soldiers. They revolt. He never makes it all the way back to Greece. And you have this massive empire that Alexander dies. And you have this massive empire that will eventually get split up into 3 separate empires.
So what time frame is this?
We're talking about the year 323, before the Common Era.
Right.
So
he died very young.
He died. He was 32 years old. That's right. He died at the age of 32.
Egypt, right?
I don't know where exactly he died. He died. It makes sense. Yeah, no one really knows what he died from. This is a very exotic disease. So the empire, the massive empire, is split into 3 smaller empires. We have the Macedonian Greek Empire, which is kind of Greek proper. When we think of Greece today, you're going to go visit Greece, that's kind of where Macedonia is. Actually, in Jewish sources, Alexander of Macedonia is called Alexander of Macedonia, so he's called Macedonia, is the name even then. You have the Seleucid which is like the Assyrian, kind of we think of things that are further east. So like Syria, what we call Syria today, Iran, Iraq, Persia, those areas were controlled by the Seleucids. And the Ptolemite is spelled with a PT, like you don't pronounce the P. The Ptolemite kingdom, which is Egypt. And you have this friction that's going to develop where you have the Jews and Israel that are sandwiched right between the Assyrian or the Seleucid Greeks and the Ptolemite or Egyptian Greeks. And that's going to exist for a few hundred years, where they're going to be kind of sandwiched in between these two mighty empires. And the Israel is a very crucial piece of land because it has access to the Mediterranean. It was the center point for a lot of ancient trade routes. So it's a very crucial piece of land that is also going to be the place, kind of a battleground between these two warring empires, the Seleucids and the Ptolemaites. So originally, the Israel was under the control of the Ptolemaites. That would go from about the year, I don't know exactly when it started, because it was, once all the dust settled, they were under the control of the Ptolemaites, and that would go until the year 198 before the Common Era, when the Seleucids would capture Israel, and they would remain, Israel remain under Seleucid rule for the next couple of decades until we have the Macabbean Revolt. The Macabbean Revolt was when the Jews revolted and they gained sovereignty over the land of Israel, and they would have sovereignty until the Romans came. So that's the big picture. Now, smaller picture, we have, as we mentioned when we talked about the Greeks, when they had conquest, it was not just territory, it was about ideology as well. So they had a way of life, they were very developed in philosophy and art and architecture, etc. And when they would capture territory, they would also infuse that territory with their way of thinking and their philosophy, which has the name. What's the name of Greek philosophy? Hellenism. Hellenism or Hellenistic. Now that began already with Alexander, and it continued by these kind of the replacements or the continuations with the Ptolemaites and the Seleucids. But what we find from, let's say, the century of Israel under Ptolemaic rule was that they were a lot more tolerant. It seems like they were a lot more wealthy as well. They were more advanced, and therefore the Jews kind of it was always there on the surface. And there were always a lot of Jews, unfortunately, that did kind of become these, quasi-Greeks, and they kind of a lot of Jews abandoned their dedication or their tradition to Judaism. But the vast majority of Jews remained true to Judaism. But there was always this internal friction, and this would play out internally, but also it would also express itself when you have outside forces kind of vying for the Jewish consciousness. And, we find historically, this is an amazing pattern that you see again and again, that the Jews themselves are much better at self-destruction than the Gentiles are at destroying the Jews. We suffer a lot more from internal discord and Jew fighting against Jew. That hurts us a lot more than the fights with what we would call kind of our natural antagonists or enemies.
Go to a parliamentary meeting in Israel
Oh,
sometime.
that's fantastic.
I got on there with my life.
Yeah, it's incredible when you think of you think of Congress as being like, everyone's put together, everyone looks really nice and polished, and these are like politicians, they try to reach across the aisle. In Israel, it's pandemonium. They're just fighting. They hurl insults at each other like, Jews and democracy. So it's 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So yes, but I think in Israel, you do see this a lot. We'll talk more about the factionalism and sectarianism that existed back then, and kind of the parallels that we have today in Israel. But in these times, we're talking about the 3rd century before the Common Era, so the year 300 to the year 200. We have a lot of friction. We have the Hellenized Jews. We have the more traditional Jews. We're going to meet a new group of Jews that's going to take off what's called the Sadducees. They don't exist today. I don't hear the term Sadducee. It's a very famous term because Josephus, our preeminent historian, talks about them at great length. And in Jewish sources, we have the Tzidokim. Every page, not every page of Talmud, but you find them a lot because they were a major player. We also have another group called the Baitusim. There was this one rabbi whose name was Antignos, and it's interesting. You have a lot of Jews adopting Greek names. We mentioned last time that Alexander kind of captured Jerusalem and Israel peacefully. There was no battle whatsoever. It was the only time that Jerusalem was captured without bloodshed. And I told you guys the whole story that he met Rabbi Shimon, the high priest, and he got off his horse. So they made a pledge to name all their kids, all the male children born for the year afterwards. They would name them all Alexander. That's why Alexander is a common Jewish name till today. Sender, the name Sender.
Is that story documented in secular sources?
No, remember, we don't have documentation of any. I'm saying external documentation of almost anything in the ancient world is non-existent. You don't have the internet. You don't have newspapers. No. It's a good question.
Well, because
it's a good question.
Well, because Constantine tells the same story about converting to Christianity, and I think it's a load of hooey, and so.
It's the kind of thing. It's the kind of thing where the exact details of the stories we could always question the legitimacy and the veracity of them.
Yeah.
But the overall picture of what it paints, we know that there was no battle of Alexander capturing Jerusalem. We know that for sure.
Yeah.
So the story does jive. Whether it happened exactly the way it is described, who knows? Is it historical? Remember, the Talmud was written many years afterwards, so it had to be retained as somewhat as a tradition. So is it possible that it's 100% true? Yes. Is it possible that there's some details that are not true? Also yes. But remember, the flavor of the story is more important than the actual details. And the flavor is that the Jews had a very respect for a very deep respect and admiration for Alexander. We know that lots of Jews, even till today, are called Alexander, and we have this story that was enshrined in the Talmud, and we know that there was no conquest. So yes, whether the details match, who knows? But the overall flavor of the story is for sure. There's something to it. But what you do find is that a lot of after this episode, you have a lot of Jews adopting Greek names. You have a guy named Antignos. What kind of Jewish name is Antignos? It's like Abraham, Judah. These are Jewish names. And Antignos. I think it was a Greek name, and that was a common thing. We're going to meet a high priest. A high priest. This is like the leader of the people, right? This is the spiritual leader of the people, or at least it was supposed to be. The office of the high priest got corrupted. A high priest by the name of Jason. Does that sound like a name for a high priest? I don't know. So we were saying, what were we saying? I don't remember what we were up to.
We're talking about the different subgroups of Judaism.
Oh yes. So we have this guy named Antignos. He was the Nasi. Nasi is a term for a prince. He was a political leader amongst the people, and he was also the Av Beit Din. He was also the head of the Sanhedrin. We talked about the Sanhedrin last time, a few times ago, I think. Sanhedrin was the Supreme Court. It was a group established by Moses. It remained uninterrupted till the 2nd century of the Common Era. So he was the spiritual and the political leader of the people, and he had these two students. One of them's name was Tzadok. One of them's name was Baitos. And these two students kind of took their own path, and they developed their own subset of our religion. And the one thing that the core of the conflict was the idea of the authority of the rabbis and the oral Torah. And they questioned the interpretations that were part of what the mainstream Judaism kind of believed and practiced, and they developed their own oral Torah. And what's interesting, it's important to point out, is that the Sadducees, if you would look at a Sadducee today, if you were able to he would look like a very observant religious Jew. In fact, in many areas, they were even more observant than what we call the Pharisees or the Perushim, or what's the mainstream Jews. The vast majority of the Jews, they were in many areas more stringent because they had to. You have to develop your own oral Torah if you want to reject the traditional oral Torah. You have to develop your own, because a lot of the things in the Torah itself, the written Torah, it's not described in detail how to do it. It's clear there has to be some sort of accompanying corpus of information that is going to explain to you, for example, what tefillin is. We read in the Shema, you should put totafos between your eyes. That's all it says. You could scour the entire Torah from the first word of Genesis to the last word of Deuteronomy, from the word Bereshit to the word Yisrael, and you won't find any description of what it looks like. What does it mean, totafot? What does that word even mean? What does it mean? What does it look like? How do you strap it? How do you bind it? Right? There's no instruction. Clearly, there has to be some sort of external instruction. And that's why, and if you look today, you look at the Jews, and look at Jews from any part of the world, and they all wear the same tefillin. They're all black. They're all black boxes. They're all made of the same material. They, the one on the head, it's actually not between the eyes. It means it's directly between your eyes, but it's actually on your head. It's aligned. And the one on the head has 4 compartments, and each compartment contains a scroll. And the one on the arm has 1 compartment that contains 1 scroll that contains those 4 sections of the Torah. And when they had the discoveries at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls, they found tefillin there. The tefillin there today are identical to the tefillin that we have. So yes, and we have the Yemenite Jews who kind of went in their own way after the destruction of the first temple. So they're not even part of our discussion. They disappeared from the Jewish view for 2,400 years, and they reemerged in this past century, in the 20th century, in the 1950s and 60s. The Yemenite Jews came all to Israel, because when they established the Jewish state, all the Arab states sent their Jews packing. So all the Arab states, which is when they're talking about the right of return of the Palestinians or Arabs coming back to Israel, no one ever mentions that there was a comparable amount, or even more, I think, of Jews that were banished from their homelands, and they have been living there for also thousands of years. No one talks about that, of course. Probably because they don't want to go back. Who would want to go back to Yemen? Disaster that place is. So the Jews came from Yemen, came to Israel, and we mentioned this with regards to their Torah scrolls. They brought their Torah scrolls, and the Torah scrolls were identical, because the method of perpetuating a Torah scroll is, done with such precision, and there's so many safety measures that were enacted to ensure that Torah scrolls are copied perfectly. Similarly, when they brought their tefillin were identical. Jews throughout the world have the same tefillin. And that's obviously a testament to some other method of instruction, and what we call the oral Torah. So when you have the Sadducees, that this group emerges, they rejected the traditional oral Torah, but they had to develop their own Torah, their own oral Torah, because there are a lot of gaps that are not filled. If you actually want to live as a Jew as per the instruction of the Torah, you can't do it unless you take some sort of interpretation. So you have the option of taking the interpretation that is the entire Jewish people are doing for millennia, or you can make up your own, and then who knows if it's any more accurate than what we already have. Interestingly, we find many mentions within the written Torah itself that there must be some oral documentation. For example, in Deuteronomy chapter 12, verse 21, we have the instruction of the ritual slaughter, shechting of an animal. You want to eat an animal, so you could either eat the animal by going to the temple and having a sacrifice and eating your steak, or you could be in Houston, Texas, and you have kosher food. And then kosher food there's a method of making ritually slaughtering an animal and making it kosher. And there's lots of details to that. And it says in the Torah, it says, hey, if you want to eat food, I'll get to you in a second, if you want to eat food, but it's not in the form of a sacrifice, so you should slaughter it as per my instruction. It says, kasher tzivisi, as I instructed. And the Torah clearly is referencing some sort of instruction. But if you look from the first one of Genesis, the last one of Deuteronomy, you won't find any reference to that instruction, yes.
What's the big difference between the Sadducees and Pharisees?
The Sadducees and the Pharisees?
What's the big difference? I mean, I know that they have a different world, but there's usually some big division.
Yeah, so whenever you have a group that splinters away from another group, right, what they always do is they take on a name for themselves, but they also rename the original group. So the Pharisees are the original group. That's the regular. That's the Jews that haven't taken any departures from what the tradition was. Typically, the Sadducees were the upper class, the priest class. That's why we talk about the corruption of the office of the high priest in the Second Temple. And we mentioned that while in the First Temple period, there was only a 10-year difference in the length and duration of the first versus the Second Temple. In the First Temple period, you have 18 high priests. In the Second Temple period, you have more than 300, because it was a thing that you kind of bought. You know, it was bought, and you have. It's interesting today. We could study and see how in the Mishnah even what they would try to do to weed out Sadducee high priests, because they would deliberately try to corrupt the procedure and the routines in the temple. So if you open up the book of Yoma, the book of Yoma is a book in the Mishnah which is written on Yom Kippur. And it talks obviously about fasting and that, and repenting, what we do today. But the vast majority of the book deals with what the high priest did on Yom Kippur, because in the temple, everything that they did was done by the high priest. The high priest had to stay up the entire night. So it describes how he had to stay up overnight, and what he do if he starts drifting off, and they would try to keep him up, and they would take off his shoes and put him on the cold floor to keep him awake. At the crack of dawn, he starts working, and he doesn't stop working till the day's over, because there's very intricate processes. He has to change his clothes 10 times, because there's the gold clothes and the white clothes, and he goes into the Holy of Holies, where he sees where the Ark of the Covenant is. There's only one time a year does anyone actually go in there. That's the Kohen Gadol, the high priest on Yom Kippur. So it's the book about Yom Kippur, and it describes that the rabbis of the Sanhedrin would pull over the high priest and say to him, listen, they would force him to swear that he's not going to deviate away from the method of the procedures of Yom Kippur. And they would make him swear, and the Talmud describes the words that they would make him say, and he would cry, and they would cry because they suspected him of being someone who's going to deliberately sabotage the process. Very interesting. You have a community, a Judaism that's somewhat united. They have one temple, and they have one religion, and they have one Torah, but there's a very, very deep-seated differences, and you don't know. Is this a Torah? Is he going to deliberately try to sabotage? What are you going to do? We have the entire Jewish people that are relying on this one Kohen. He was nominated, so to speak, even though he actually probably bought it from the authorities. They would just pay whoever pays the highest dollar is gonna do it. That's what it was, unfortunately. But they represented the entire people, and we want to make sure that he does it in a way he's not going to sabotage it. So that's existing during the times of we have the Hellenized Jews, which are the ones that just say screw it all, we're becoming like the Greeks, and they kind of rejected a lot of what it means to be Jewish. Were they completely like the Greeks? Obviously not. They were still Jewish, but they were Hellenized. We would call today is they kind of assimilated. They're still Jews. They might still have some, Jewish affiliation, whatever, but they're assimilated. It's not that big of a deal in their lives. You have these Sadducees and the Baitusim, and these are Jews that are very into their Judaism and very involved, but they take a divergent path. And you have the Pharisees, the Perushim. Now, these denominations will expand by the time we reach the first century of the Common Era. We're going to meet other groups like the Essenes, like the Sikarim, like the Kanayim, like the Biryonim, all these different groups, and that will create this firestorm, like this internal battle will create a firestorm that will eventually culminate in the Great Revolt and eventually in the destruction of the First Temple. Now, what happened of note, one major item of note happened in the 3rd century before the Common Era that it's very important to talk about. You have the Greeks. The Jews are under the control of the Ptolemite Greeks. They took somewhat of a lesser position in trying to Hellenize the Jews. Yes, Hellenism was they were into, but they were kind of like, when people make a lot of money, kind of ideology kind of falls by the wayside. That's what happens. So So they were well-to-do, and they weren't pushing their agenda that much. But they were fascinated by the Jews. The Greeks were always fascinated by the Jews because they kind of found a certain kinship amongst people that had the same desire for knowledge, and philosophy. And you're living in a sea of pagans and a sea of probably very ignorant people. And the Jews are 100% literate. The Jews have a very organized system of life. They have philosophy, very very developed and sophisticated philosophy. And the Greeks, on the other hand, also were very into language and literacy and art and beauty. And they kind of had a lot in common, even though they were very different. The Greeks were renowned in their paganism as well. They had this fascination with the Zeus guy, and that's antithetical to what we believe in, this one invisible God. But they were also fascinated by that, the idea of one God, all the power just coalesced into one God. And it's invisible. It was so bizarre and so it was exciting. Also, it's like kind of today we have like the Near Eastern religions are very appealing. Like the Zen and the Buddhism. A lot of people find that very exciting. That's what Judaism was 2,000 years ago. So this Ptolemite emperor, I can't remember the third or the fourth, whatever. I think it was the fourth. He invited, now the term invited, we could probably put quotations around them. He invited the Jews to write a Greek translation of the Torah. And he actually took 70 rabbis, and he isolated them so that way they can conspire to write a kind of a Greek-friendly edition. So that's what if you ever heard the term Septuagint, Septuagint is the first translation of the Torah that was written under the stewardship of Ptolemy. I think the fourth. I think it was the fourth. Let's see if I can find it over here. Is that right? The fourth?
We won't remember anyway, fourth or third.
There were about 20 of them. So.
Yeah. Yeah, you would think they'll come up with more like clever names, So, in Jewish sources, we have a description of the changes that there were 36 changes that they actually made in the translation, and they all independently came to the realization that these changes had to be made, or else the Greeks would find major beef with the people.
The 70 rabbis individually made identical.
That is the Jewish tradition. It's portrayed as some sort of miracle that they each independently realized that these 36 particular changes were necessary. Because if you read the Torah and you don't have the nuance and the kind of background and the methodology that we use to understand it, there will be some things that clearly don't make sense. The first example that we give is just in the very first chapter of Genesis. You have this one God that we're talking about, and we know that throughout the Torah we're dealing with this one God. And then God says, "Let us make man. Let us make man. Na'aseh Adam." Right? And that one letter, that one nun, makes it a plural. So there's as if there's multiple people or multiple individuals, multiple entities that are conspiring to make man. Now, in Jewish tradition, obviously this is not multiple gods. Now, if you just open up any one of the Jewish sources that talk about that, they reference this midrash that says that God is teaching us humility because God he consulted with the angels that this is a good idea. Let's make man in our image. Let us make man. So it's God consulting with the angels. It's not that there's multiple entities that have control. It's just one God, but he was consulting with the angels. So that's a nuance that we have because we have the midrash and we have the perspective of how to read it, not as a literal document, but to know that there's more behind just the surface understanding of the words. But if you just translate that, clearly there's an inconsistency in the very first chapter. So that was an example of one thing that they changed.
So what is it right? Let me make man?
I think they wrote let I make. Yeah, I'm going to make man, basically.
So wait, I'm confused. Did they make these changes to appease the Greeks so that they wouldn't kill him, or because they made
I
these
think there was
changes
some of
so that
that.
the Greeks could better understand
I
the
think
Torah?
I think it was probably a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of kind of maybe rounding the edges of the things that could potentially invoke enmity from the host nation, and also probably a little bit of clearing up of what could be perceived as inconsistencies from a unsophisticated, superficial reading of the text. A little bit of both.
So what happened to that translation ultimately?
We still have it. We still have a Septuagint. It's still around,
But
and
it's
we
not,
know what's
it's
interesting.
not necessarily valid, right? Because
Well,
of
I'm
those
saying
changes?
it's still. We have the original Hebrew text.
Okay.
We have no problem with the actual
Oh,
Hebrew
okay.
text. But when you deal with translations, and it's also very important as a historical marker, when we talk about the Torah, we know for sure, because it's been in Gentile hands for about 2,200 years. So whenever we deal with kind of looking at the Torah, the written Torah, from a historical lens, we know that it's not just us holding this document. It's been in secular or Gentile hands for at least since the time of the Septuagint. But what's also interesting from at that time period, what this actually enabled, it was actually, there's a minor fast day. It's not actually observed as a fast day, but it's a day of, it's considered to be a day of mourning, the day that they completed the Septuagint, because this is the first time that the Torah is going to be in non-Jewish hands. And that is going to open the door to a lot of, their critiquing our religion. But additionally, it's going to open up the door for Jews learning Greek. Because the Jews, once you have that, you know Hebrew, and now you see the Greek translation, it's very easy for you to learn. Exactly. Yes, exactly. So you'll see that there's going to, after this point, you're going to see a rise in inroads or in confluence, if that's even a word, between the Jewish people and the Greeks, because now they can learn Greek, and now they have some sort of common text that they can discuss with their Greek friends, etc. Okay, so that's the Septuagint, and we have obviously the factionalism within the Jewish people, and the year 198 is going to be a pivotal year, because that's the year that the Seleucids and Antiochus III, he is going to capture Israel from the Ptolemies. And the Seleucids, they had this, like we said, an inferiority complex towards the Ptolemies, and they're going to take a much more proactive stance in trying to Hellenize the Jews. So you have Antiochus III, and then his son, Antiochus IV, he took over, and he was a little bit more ruthless and brutal than his father, and he began to attempt to systematically dismantle and deconstruct the Jewish religion. And he wanted to make it into somewhat of a Greek hub. He knew, obviously, like we mentioned, he understood that it was a very crucial location in the world. It was a place, obviously, that had access to major trade routes and to the Mediterranean, and he believed that the only way for him to actually achieve what he set out to do was if he made the local indigenous population, he made them into like Greek and Hellenized citizens. That's one of the reasons given as to why he began this crusade, if you will, of attempting to basically end the Jewish religion as we know it. There are other reasons given as to the rationale of why he chose to do what he did. Either way, what we know for sure is that he began by deposing the high priest, was a fellow by the name of Yehoshua, and he installed his Hellenized brother Jason as the high priest. And you have now a Hellenized priest as the high priest in the temple. Think about what that means for what the Jew. And he began to institute pagan practices in the temple. Now, obviously, this is going to cause a lot of internal friction. Think about that. Imagine the most sacred and sacrosanct office of the Jewish people is now going to be defiled by what we call as Hellenized Jews, guys trying to institute Greek practice into the temple itself.
So Jason was Jewish.
Of course, he was
The
Jewish.
brother of the monarch.
That's he wasn't. No, he's brother of the previous Toynardol. And he's going to have fights with a different guy. They're fighting back and forth, and there's the armies. It's a lot of details. But that was the first thing that he did. He started meddling in the internal affairs of the Jewish people. He forbade any time-related Jewish practice. We know that our religion is heavily governed by time-based rituals. So obviously we have the Shabbat is every Saturday. We have the holidays that are very much linked to the lunar calendar. We have very sophisticated methods of organizing the calendar. We know already in the Talmudic sources, in the Mishnah, thousands of years ago, they had exact, down to the second, calculations of the lunar month. So you ask most people, like, how long is the lunar month? They won't know that the correct answer is 29 days, 12 hours, 44 minutes, 3 seconds. That is down to the second. It's incredible the sophistication they had, because it's so important, because that basically is the rhythm of Jewish life. There's the holidays, and then the holidays of Rosh Hashanah is on the first day of the month of Tishrei, and Passover is on the 15th of Nisan, and these themes are very much govern how we live as Jews. And Titus understood, if you want to disconnect the Jews from their religion, one of the things that you will do is you're going to forbid them to update their calendar and constantly be recalibrating their calendar, and then they don't know, is Passover today, is it tomorrow, is it yesterday, is it a week from now, who knows? So that was one thing that he did. He forbade, on pain of death, the study of Torah, publicly burned Torah scrolls and other Jewish sacred books. He forbade the practice of kosher consumption, the laws of family purity, laws of nida, he forbade. And lastly, and this is the thing that probably the most challenged mitzvah of all time, he forbade circumcision. And we know the Greeks had a fascination with the human body, and they considered circumcision to be profaning of what they believe to be beautiful and to be holy, and that is the human body. And we know that the Greeks and their gymnasiums, everyone engaged in sport in the nude. That was common. You look at all the Greek. You look at all the Greek statues. There's all these perfectly sculpted macho men, all in the nude, and that was common practice. They had the Greeks. They had public toilets installed, and it was just basically like a bench with a hole in it, and that was just common. That's what people did. Because why should you be embarrassed of this beauty that you have? Now the Jews are all circumcised. So now, if a Jew wants to make inroads into just the men, right? Into that's correct. Into the Greek world, he wants to participate in the gymnasium. Like, what are you going to do now? You have you're mutilated. Everyone's going to laugh at you. So they would go engage on this circumcision reversal surgery. It's called Moshe Harlasa. They would try to take whatever remaining flesh is there, try to pull it back and try to undo. Which sounds, yes, that's the ooh factor. It's very high, very painful, and So that's what they would do. But that's what the Hellenized Jews would do. In fact, it's interesting that our sages tell us that when someone does that, when someone does a circumcision reversal surgery, they're basically excommunicated from the people. Even though, interestingly, there's no mitzvah in the Torah, there's no prohibition in the Torah, do not undo your circumcision. But it seems like it was kind of like a symbolism. There was heavy symbolism that this is a mark of a Jew. Someone is choosing to run away from that. Well, then they're kind of separated themselves from the people. I have a nice here quote from a book that I read. Barrel Wine. It's, I think, Echoes of Glory. It talks about the Jewish people in that time as follows. It talks about the persecution of Jewish practice under Antiochus IV. Women who allowed their sons to be circumcised were killed with their sons tied around their neck. The scholars of Israel were hounded, hunted down, and killed. Jews who refused to eat pork or sacrifice hogs were tortured to death. Even the smallest hamlets in Judah were not safe from the oppression of the Greeks. The altars of Zeus and other pagan deities were erected in every village, and Jews of every area were forced to participate in sacrificial services. They tried to think about that. They think about what kind of oppression on the religious life of the people of that time. They began to try to attempt to sacrifice pigs in the temple, even though that didn't happen till later. So what you actually have here is very interesting, is the first religious and ideological war. The Antiochus and the Assyrian or Seleucid Greeks, they already had control of the territory. They were there. They were in charge. But they began this war. It was a religious war. It was trying to separate the Jews from their religion, not necessarily separate the Jews from the land, because they already had that. So you have this combination of the external pressure of the conquering nation, their increase in oppression and intolerance towards us practicing our religion, they enacting many rules prohibiting very basic elements of Jewish practice. You have the internal infighting, the Sadducees and the high priest and the high society sect on one hand, the Pharisees, more the traditional, the mainstream, the vast majority of the Jews on the other hand, and this third group, the Hellenized Jews, that said, let's just all become Greeks, and why do we have to live this arcane way of life? And this was obviously bound to erupt, and it in fact did with the Macabbean revolt of the year 67. Now, the year 67, we have somewhat of a discrepancy of the years. We can use the year 67 because that's, I think, the accepted in secular sources. It seems like in Jewish sources it might be a little later, the year 38. Either way, I don't think it's that relevant for us. Just know there's debate as to when exactly it happened. And the revolt began in the city called Modi'in. It was began by an individual by the name of Matthias or Matisyahu. And he had his 5 sons, 5 famous sons. Judah Maccabee, we will know him. Other names of his sons are Shimon, Elazar, Yochanan, and Yonatan. What actually happened, Modi'in is in central Israel. What happened was there was the local, garrison or whatever. They, like we said, they take every little, they would try to institute pagan practice in every little town. So they came to town and they said, okay, who here is going to sacrifice a pig to Zeus? And obviously this is something which is anathema to the Jews. But there was this one Hellenized Jew who said, okay, I'll do it. And he gets up there and he makes the sacrifice, and this enraged Matthias, and he said, I'm just going to go kill them all. So he pulls out a dagger and he goes and he slashes and he kills this Hellenized Jew, and he starts attacking the Greeks, and this sparks a massive revolt that would begin 25 years of resistance and would culminate in the Jewish people and under the leadership of the Maccabees, would culminate in them actually driving the Greeks out of Israel and establishing sovereignty and establishing their own leadership. We have this famous war cry, Mi kamocha be'elim Hashem. That's the term. The word Maccabee in Hebrew is an acronym for Mi kamocha be'elim Hashem. Who is like you amongst God? Hashem, our God. We have Mila Hashem Elad, the rallying cry of the Maccabees. Who the story goes, the legend goes, whether it's true or not, the details, right? Matthias cries out, "Who is the God? Come with me." So they flee to the hills and they assemble this ragtag group of Jewish fighters. Obviously, they weren't trained. They were Jews. They weren't professional. They didn't have professional equipment or professional training, but they assemble a group of maybe 10 to 12,000. That's the numbers roughly given. And they begin this war against professional fighters, a group of somewhat in the neighborhood of 40,000. So they were vastly outnumbered. And not only were they outnumbered in just men and fighting forces, but also in training, in equipment, and in war elephants. Now you say, what's a war elephant? So in ancient warfare, it was the equivalent of a tank. You have an elephant that's trained for this kind of battle. It just barrels through. And you have, on top of that, you have these guys throwing spears or shooting arrows. It was just a tremendous, tremendous force that the Greeks had and the Jews didn't. What's interesting is that Judah eventually he was the military leader of this rebellion. He actually died in an attack on a war elephant. He went under. He thought there was this Greek general on top of the war elephant, so he went under it and he killed the elephant, but the elephant collapsed on him and just killed him. And he actually thought that there was a general. In fact, there actually wasn't a general. And eventually, in war, the majority of Matthias' sons died. The survivor was Shimon. But obviously, because they had major disadvantages militarily, they had to come up with clever schemes, and they did. I once said I have a friend of mine in Israel who lives in Atlanta now, but he gave a whole class. Maybe I could find it somewhere in my archives. He gave a whole class about all the details of the military war, and they would have to use these clever schemes, and they would use these trickery. They would split up, and they would attack from both sides, attack in the middle of the night. They didn't care. The Jews were crazy maniacs. They fought like crazy maniacs. You find this today. We think of Jews as these quiet, nice Jewish boy, right? That these lawyers that they do good nits. And in ancient times, these Jews were maniacs, and they fought, and no one wanted to fight them. The Jews revolted. We'll see when we deal with the Romans. The Jews revolted more than any other people in 500 years of Roman dominion of the world, and they were always scared of the Jews because the Jews, when they would fight like maniacs, like absolute maniacs. So there's a lot of details in this rebellion, but eventually, after 3 years, they were able to recapture Jerusalem. The temple's in shambles. They rededicated the temple. That's when the story of the flask of oil. The war continued, and after about 25 years, they eventually were able to send all the Assyrians packing and reestablish their own borders and their own control, their own dominion, their own sovereignty. Now, in modern times, this is always portrayed as a struggle a nationalistic struggle. The fight for national liberation and these mighty warriors, and in Israel, the Zionists always that they adopted this as a model. This battle for nationalism and this underdog that's going to take on the Jews were like these underdogs. They take on the juggernaut, the behemoth, and in reality, it wasn't so much about national liberation, nationalism. It was more about preserving the way of life, because Antiochus and the Greeks, they were limiting the Jews in religion, and the Jews have lived for many a century under foreign control, and were fine with that typically. What actually sparked the rebellion was not the nationalistic influences as much as it was just this feeling of being cornered from an ideological perspective. So that's what's very interesting about this particular rebellion. And we know we have Hanukkah coming up in about 2 weeks, and we celebrate it every year. We celebrate it. We celebrate this victory of the small group of Jews over this mighty empire. But obviously, while it has the military itself, the significance is not understated. What's interesting about what we do today in Hanukkah, and kind of the practices and the rituals that were established were all about the oil. It's remarkable. It seems like it's an afterthought. There was a massive battle. There's a tremendous miracle of the military success of the small group over the mighty empire, and that's not what we focus on during Hanukkah. We have all about the oil and the rededication of the temple. It's remarkable. I think that the lesson, there's probably a few lessons that we could draw from this, but perhaps one of the lessons is that it's important for us to not lose perspective over what was actually the impetus for this rebellion. It wasn't about the military. The military was just the tool that they had to use. And obviously it was a tremendous miracle, and we can't forget about that as well. But the flask of oil, which is representative of the temple and Jewish practice in the temple as it was when it did not have any foreign meddling, that is what they were really going for. So when we celebrate Hanukkah, of course, the most important thing about the story of the episode was the military. No one denies that. But it's important for us to not lose sight of the reason or of the cause behind it. Like, what drove the Jews to rebel and to be successful? It was about this flask of oil. Obviously, the flask of oil is representative of this way of life and this way of practice that they wanted to reclaim.
So in light of that, why is Hanukkah considered to be a minor Jewish holiday?
Well, it's interesting. It's a good question you asked, because Hanukkah was really the last holiday that was established. Purim, remember, came before that. We have the Book of Maccabees. Everyone knows the Book of Maccabees. It was a book written from Jewish sources about this whole story. It gives us all the details of the story, the Book of Maccabees. It's not included in the Jewish canon. Now, if you remember, we spoke last time, we had the Men of the Great Assembly, the body of the expanded Sanhedrin. They canonized the Bible. So that came afterwards. After the canon was completed, no other works could be included. So the Book of Maccabees could not be included, and no work afterwards can be included, as remarkable as they may have been. But also, because it is a holiday that it's not in the Torah. Remember, the Torah is 1,000 years earlier. The Torah gives us many holidays: the holiday of Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Passover, Pesach, Shavuot. Those are all holidays that are in the Torah itself. Versus, let's say, Purim and Hanukkah, these are holidays that were established as a result of the tremendous miracles that happened to the Jews in Persia during the Purim story, and to the Jews in Israel during the Hanukkah stories, and therefore they're of lesser importance. Who are we to say less important? The point is they don't have the same significance as the ones that are actually in the Torah itself. So that's why they're rabbinic law. In fact, when we talk about rabbinic law, there's only 7 mitzvahs that were established by the rabbis that we have today that are mitzvahs. One of them is Purim. One of them is Hanukkah. Lighting the candles of Hanukkah is a mitzvah, but it's rabbinic. It's not in the Torah. It doesn't say in the Torah light Hanukkah candles. Obviously, the Torah was written many, many hundreds of years earlier. So it's rabbinic law. The license that the rabbis have to enact mitzvahs, that's in the Torah. The Torah says that this group, this body of the Sanhedrin, has the right to establish mitzvahs if they decide to. And they did with 7 mitzvahs. When we talk about rabbinic law in general, most of them are not rabbinic mitzvahs, but in fact rabbinic edicts, what we call the fences around the Torah, which is not its own law, isolated law. Rather, it's a protection agent against the encroachment of a Torah law. Make sense? The classic example is that on Shabbat, one of the 39 prohibited acts on Shabbat is writing 2 letters, and that's a law in the Torah. And the rabbi said, "Don't lift a pen." So it's not its own law. It's a rabbinic law. Don't lift a pen. That's a rabbinic law, but it's not its own isolated law. In fact, it's just it's a law that was enacted to protect the Torah law. So it's a fence around the Torah law. That's what it says in the Torah: make fences around my laws. But it's not, but Hanukkah is an example of one of the very, very, very few mitzvahs that are entirely rabbinic.
What are the 7?
Maybe we should go back to history.
Yeah. Well, I don't remember all of them.
It's okay.
Lighting Shabbos candles, lighting.
The prayers before the beating, right?
I think that might be one of them as well. I get the list. Well, after the meal that's in the Torah already.
Rabbi, let me ask you a question.
Yes, question.
It's a little bit ironic that the whole celebration of Hanukkah was this miracle that Jews refused to assimilate, and the Almighty backed them in fighting this remarkable war.
And now we've assimilated.
And now it's like the Hanukkah celebration. It's like, we'll give presents so our kids don't feel left out like all the Christian kids. I mean,
Yeah, I didn't realize that the war lasted 25 years.
Yeah. A lot of people don't realize that.
I thought it was like
Yeah.
a few months.
Listen, there's more irony to that. You know, I think I might have mentioned this once before. The Israeli Olympic team is called the Maccabees. And we have like the Maccabee Games. What's remarkable is that the Olympics obviously were a Greek invention. It's like the whole, you see like this guy throwing a discus, you know? And the Maccabees, the whole reason why they were, they began the revolt is to fight against that. So it's one of the great ironies. Listen, am I going to tell you that not to give presents? I give my kids presents on Hanukkah, and I'm totally fine with that. And I think it's a good thing for them to have positive associations with mitzvahs. It's a very, very, very good thing. You know, my kids know that on Shabbat they get to drink as much Coca-Cola as they could possibly consume. Well, within moderation, you know, because to them, I want them to have positive associations with Jewish life.
Yeah.
If I say, okay, you know, sit in your seat, be quiet, and eat your vegetables, they'll say, oh, Shabbos is so miserable. And if I say, come to shul, come to synagogue, sit down in your seat, don't make a noise. And that's hard for a kid. I say, hey, come to shul, go play with your friends, have a good time. You know, I want them to realize that the mitzvahs are a privilege, and it's a positive thing. And my kids love the Shabbat. They love it. They know that they're limited. What my son tell me this week? He said he wanted to use scissors. He said scissors are muchsa. We'll use it tomorrow. He knows that in observing the Shabbat, you're going to have to make some sacrifices. But they love it. And every Friday, you know, when you have special Shabbos treats, and we have Shabbos candy, and it's delightful, and it's exciting, and there's dessert, and they get to play with their friends. They love it. And I encourage that, you know. So I think when we talk about, you know, giving gifts on Hanukkah, I think it's a very good thing, you know. It's a very good thing for us where our kids associate Jewish practice, Jewish mitzvahs, Jewish life with positive emotions.
I will say, like, we've been to Wolby House twice now. My daughter gets,
She loves it.
she gets more excited than we've ever gone to Disney World. The atmosphere is like in there. It's just,
Yeah.
She was in heaven. She was just.
Okay, so back to history. So the term Hasmonean, Hashmonaim. So the Maccabees and the Hashmonaim, they're the same group. They are going to be the family of Jewish royalty that's going to oversee this next period, about 100 years, where the Jews are going to have sovereignty over Israel. Now remember, we're going to start off this 100-year period with one of the most remarkable families and remarkable heroes that the Jewish people have ever seen. Mighty warriors, tremendously dedicated to the Torah, just a fantastic group of great heroes. Unfortunately, one of the great tragedies in Jewish history is this family is going to devolve. And by the end of this 100-year period, we're going to have that these Hasmoneans being declaring themselves as king, even though, remember, they were priests. And to be a king in the Jewish people, you have to come from the house of David. David is from the tribe of Judah. Priests are from the tribe of Levi. They made this critical error of declaring themselves kings. Many of them became Sadducees and Hellenized. Many of them conspired against the masses, and there was a lot of friction. Eventually, they're going to be the ones who are going to invite the Romans in. But it started off with Shimon. Shimon was the last surviving son of Matthias. He had 5 sons. We know Judah Maccabee, of course, we know him. Other ones as well. They all participated in some form or another in rebellion. Shimon was the last one, and he took on the title of Nasi. Nasi means president of the people.
President?
Yeah.
In Prince.
President. Now, there's a clear distinction between the term Nasi and the term Melech, a king. He understood, obviously, that he had no claims to the throne because in the Jewish world, unless you're from the house of David, you cannot be a king. This distinction of calling himself prince was going to be lost in future generations, and already, like his son, his name was Yochanan. Let's see if I remember his name here. Name written down somewhere here. Yochanan Hyrcanus, or something like that. Got so many names here to remember. So his son was really going to be become eventually a Sadducee. And his son, and they're going to be infighting, they're going to be assassinations. They're going to get invited to parties, and they're going to be assassinated. It's crazy what goes on. Brothers killing each other. It's just they were fighting back and forth over the kingdom. We're going to meet a guy by the name of Alexander Yanai. He was a king and a high priest. This is common in the house of the Hasmoneans. Even though he was a Sadducee, and famous story that we have about him was that he, on the holiday of Sukkot, there was a mitzvah that the Sadducees rejected, the mitzvah of a water libation, a very special mitzvah that they only did once a year. A special water libation, they take water from the Silwan, from the river that goes right outside of the temple area, and they were poured on the altar. So all the Jews are there, and this guy Alexander Yanai, what kind of name is that, Alexander Yanai? Anyhow, he's a king and he's the high priest, even though he has no right to be the king, and he decides to screw with the people. So he takes, instead of pouring the water on the altar, he pours water on his legs. And that just, incensed the people. And everyone's there. They all started throwing their swords at him. So he was pelted by thousands of He almost died. And he freaked out. And he told his mercenaries to go stamp out this rebellion. And they slaughtered, I think the number that we have in the sources is 6,000 people were slaughtered by this horrible episode. So this kind of gives us an insight of what it was like. What it was like living with the Hasmoneans and how they kind of devolved away from their tremendous roots and became this family of leaders that rejected their beginnings.
What year was that?
That was the year 95, before the Common Era. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Let's see if it's written down here. We have one of them. I apologize for not remembering the name here. I think his name was also Yochanan. He did something. His name is Shimon's son. His name was Yochanan. Yochanan Hyrcanus, I think his name was. Hyrcanus. He made a mistake that the Jewish people would suffer enormously from. He did something unprecedented before that or afterwards in Jewish life. In an attempt to expand the borders, he did forcible conversions. He proselytized. He proselytized, but he forced conversions. We know that in Jewish law, conversion is something that we do not force. We don't encourage. If someone wants to convert, they can convert. But it was never forced, and it wasn't even encouraged. If someone wants to convert, let them convert. But he took masses of people and forced them to become Jewish in an effort to expand the Jewish influence. One of the groups that he converted was the Idumeans. And this caused a lot of problems because there was this major question as to the legitimacy of the Jewishness of these people. You have tons of people that are quote-unquote Jews, they're Jewish citizens, but who knows if they're really Jewish. And one of the descendants of these Idumeans is a fellow by the name of Herod the Great, son of Antipater. He was an Idumean, and when you read about the conflict that Herod had with the Jews, a lot of it was based with this major question as to the legitimacy of his Jewishness. And he would bring in the rabbis, and he would say to them, "Hey, am I Jewish?" And they would have to tiptoe around him because he was a madman. Herod was a madman. He slaughtered thousands of rabbis. In fact, Herod, we'll get to him a little bit later, but Herod, he decreed, he was basically Stalin. the same kind of individual. He was tremendously paranoid. He assassinated members of his own family, anyone who he considered to be in any way questioning his authority. Ruthless and brutal. He'd kill his own wife and his 5 kids because he thought they were going against him. He murdered thousands of rabbis. He just had a reign of terror in his leadership. He also, interestingly, he decreed that the day he died, 1,000 rabbis should be slaughtered because he didn't want the Jews to be rejoicing. Let's think about how so sick. He didn't want the Jews to be rejoicing when he died, so he decreed that the day he died, 1,000 rabbis should be slaughtered, so that way everyone would be mourning. In reality, it didn't happen, but that just shows you what kind of individual. But he was an Edomian, and that was a result of this poor decision by Yochanan, son of Shimon, who was one of the Hasmonean kings, the Hasmonean dynasty, who made a decision that the Jewish people paid very, very dearly for that. So you have a whole string of Hasmonean kings. They were fighting with each other. All these assassinations back and forth. Alexander Yanai. We said the story about Alexander Yanai. His wife was a minor bright spot in the Hasmonean dynasty. Her name was Shlom Tzion. The Hebrew name was Shlom Tzion. Hamalka. She ruled for 9 years, and when she died in the year 67. That basically marked the end of the Hasmonean rule. She had 2 sons. One of the name was Aristobulus, I think. And the other one was also Hyrcanus. So the year 67, we have this Hasmonean dynasty is going to end. Her 2 sons are basically fighting back and forth as to who's going to be the leader. They make this ill-fated decision to ask the burgeoning Romans to mediate. So Pompey was this mighty and brutal general who was in charge of Rome. He understood that it's very important for the Romans to have a nice foothold in Israel. So he came in and he decided to mediate between these 2. So what he did was he murdered one of them, Yochanan, and he Hyrcanus, and he instituted Aristobulus to be like basically a Roman puppet leader. And you find that from that point on, I think it was the year 64, from that point on, the Romans would be in charge. And even though the Romans wouldn't have direct rule all the time, sometimes they would have direct rule, the Romans typically liked to rule by proxy. So they would have a local leader to be the quote-unquote king or administrator, but in reality they would be in charge. And if this guy, if he didn't kind of perform to the standards that they wanted, they would just execute him and move on. So Pompey, eventually we know Pompey was, he had his arch rival. They had a falling out between him and Julius Caesar. Eventually Julius Caesar takes control, and he institutes Antipater as being the proxy, the Roman leader of Israel, of Judah. And eventually his son Herod, he became king of Israel, and he ruled for about 37 years. I think, I don't know the exact years, maybe I think it was 44 to, I guess that would be 41 before the Common Era to 4 before the Common Era when he died. And he was basically the last Jewish king over Israel, even though he was still governed by the Romans. He was basically the last king of Israel. And from then on, you would have Roman procurators and administrators to be in charge of Israel for hundreds of years. Obviously, throughout the destruction of the temple, etc. Meet people by the name of Florus and Pontius Pilate, all those names that we're familiar with. Those were Romans who were in control of Israel, who were Roman procurators. They were basically administrators of Israel. And what they would do in the case of, let's say, proxy leaders, very interesting. Herod had his two sons were basically taken captive to Rome. So you would have a local leader. It's very, very interesting how they would do that. So the Romans take control of territory. They institute a local to be the proxy ruler. They would take his kids and bring them to Rome, and they would grow up in Rome. And the way it worked is that if he misbehaved, that his kids are done. Very smart to take like collateral. So Herod's kids grew up in Rome.
But also the future generation of rulers would be sorely Romanized.
Exactly. So this guy Herod, like we already mentioned, he was an Idumean, so he wasn't even Jewish, or maybe he was. We have this whole, he was, yeah, he was Jewish, yeah. He was a renowned builder. He's one of the greatest builders in history. We know that he built these massive cities, all of them, these grandiose cities. He built the largest Caesarea everywhere. Every city they called Caesarea because you gotta curry favor with the Romans. He built the fortress at Masada, right? This tremendous with palaces. We know that Masada is the one archaeological site in Israel that was fully excavated. So we have, if you go there today, you see these amazingly ornate palaces that Herod built, and he built it as a completely self-sustaining civilization. So you actually had, we know that the resistance at Masada outlasted everyone throughout the Great Revolt to the year 73. So 3 years after the temple was destroyed, all of Judah is burning, and the people, the Jews that were in Masada, about 1,000 people, they were still around. They actually committed suicide because the Romans had no idea how to get up there because it was so well fortified, and it was so they could lay siege to it, but it doesn't matter because it was self-sustaining. They had agriculture up there as well, the agriculture and water and everything. They were able to be self-sustaining up there. That was built by Herod. He built Herodium. Herodium is the largest man-made mountain in the world. He refurbished the temple, and he built the most magnificent temple in history. In fact, the Talmud says that whoever, if you didn't see the temple of Herod, you never saw a beautiful building in your life. That's what it says. So beautiful. It describes these like blue waves of crystals, gorgeous. He built the platform. The largest man-made platform in the world is Temple Mount. On Temple Mount, you could put 12 football fields. It's enormous. It's the largest religious site in the world. Bigger than in Mecca, Medina. I think it's bigger than anything that the Christians have. It's enormous.
When they refer to the Temple of Herod, they're referring to what
Yes.
now is the Western Wall.
Well, the Western Wall, interestingly, also built by Herod. The Western Wall is the retaining site of that, retaining wall of that man-made platform.
So those are the Romans who destroyed the Temple of Herod.
Yes. Well, now, what he refurbished it in the year 19. It's a very interesting story. I actually have it over here in the sources. I want to read to you why he decided why he decided to refurbish the temple. He refurbished the temple in the year 19 before the Common Era. It's just even the Western Wall. You see, like if you ever go there, you see these massive stones, enormous stones, and it's a great, tremendous feat of engineering and architecture for him to actually do that. And it actually goes much further down. If you go to the tunnel tours in Israel, you go further down. It was just I don't know exactly the details. It was just but very deep. You have these massive. This one rock, I think it raised like 50,000 tons. It's just incredible how they actually moved it. We know that he actually to build the just to build the platform to support the platform that he built, it took 10,000 men 10 years to do. He would undertake these enormous engineering and architectural projects that would take years and years to finish. And he built palaces everywhere, north, south, anywhere you want. He had a palace.
Was this slave labor?
It was not slave labor, actually. You paid him. He was very, they collected a lot of taxes. They had a lot of money. It was not slave labor, interestingly.
How about the seaport of Haifa?
Yeah, well, he built Caesarea, not just a little south of Haifa, Caesarea, which was at that point the largest port in the world. He built that. He just had these he was a megalomaniac, basically. He was a narcissistic, paranoid megalomaniac.
So what was his motivation in
Oh, so there's a Talmud tells this great story. Listen to this Talmud story. A Talmud, there's a whole section of Talmud that talks about the friction that he had with the rabbis. Because remember, they weren't even sure if he's Jewish. He would say, "Am I Jewish?" Not, and then they would say, and then he would execute them all. So listen to this. I'm reading this quote from Baba Basra, page 3. Herod went and killed most of the rabbis. However, he left Bava ben Buta alive in order to use him as an advisor. So he killed lots of rabbis, and he left one of them by the name of Bava ben Buta. That was his name. Herod put a crown of sharpened porcupine skin around his eyes, and these spikes, they blinded him. So he basically gouged out this rabbi's eyes. One day, Herod, he was pretending to be a regular citizen. He sat down in front of Bava Buta. He was blind, and he started talking to him. He says, "Rabbi, do you realize the horrible things that this no-good slave is doing?" So he was referring to himself, Herod himself. So Bava ben Buta responded, "What should I do? What can I do about what Herod's doing?" So Herod himself is talking to him, and he says to him, "Curse him. I want you to curse him." He was basically looking for legitimacy to go against, to just execute him or execute all the rabbis, whatever. So Bava ben Buta said, "How can I curse him? It says," and he quotes a verse from Ecclesiastes, "Even in your thoughts, do not curse a king." You can now not curse a king. Herod's a king. So Herod responded, "He's not a king. He doesn't fit the criteria. He might not be Jewish." So Bava ben Buta says, even if he's not a king, he is no less than a rich man. And that same verse in Ecclesiastes says, "And in your bedchamber do not curse the rich." Says, what time I'm not going to curse Herod? He's rich. And he is certainly no different than a leader. And it says, and he quotes another verse, this is a verse in Exodus, "V'nasi b'am chalosar," do not curse a leader of your people. So Herod basically tells him, "Listen, I'm Herod." So Herod then confessed, "I am Herod, and if I had known that the rabbis were so careful in their words, I would not have killed them. Now please tell me, what can I do to rectify what I have done? How do I repent for this?" So Bava responded, "Since you snuffed out the light of the world," which is reference to all the rabbis that you killed to provide insight and vision for the people, "you should involve yourself in increasing the light in the world," which is reference to the temple. And someone who and the Talmud concludes, someone who has not seen the temple that Herod built has not seen the magnificent building in his life. That's a story of Herod and the motivation that he had to refurbish the temple. So he went out of his way to build the most magnificent building in the world. And if the great wonders of the world of ancient times had not been already sealed before that, probably most of Herod's accomplishments would have been included in that list. The temple would have been included. Herodium would have been included. Herodium was a man-built mountain that was about 1,000 feet tall. It was enormous, with aqueducts and palaces, and just remarkable. It's still, you could go visit it today in Israel.
The story I got was-
Masada. Yes, go ahead.
The story I got was that where I see it, the Israelis conquered Herod's place and made his father and him convert or something like that.
No, that was earlier. That was early. Yochanan. Yes. So
But then the snobs in Israel refused to, because he was trying to convert, they refused him to recognize him.
Yeah, well, but we point, as I mentioned, to Yochanan, son of Shimon, who did this forcible conversion as making a crucial mistake. Because all he did was invite this question of the legitimacy of all these Jews. So you're incorporating all these Jews into your nation, but then there's going to be a major question that would continue for decades as to whether or not they're really Jews.
Yeah, like, are they truly Jewish in their heart and committed to the Jewish
Yeah,
cause?
and
they just wolves in sheep's clothing through forced conversion.
Exactly.
That's ultimately the question.
Exactly. So it was a mistake that the Jews themselves did, and they brought so much pain and suffering and agony on the heels of that decision, with kind of what they had to deal with Herod and everything that came afterwards. So now Herod dies. He had 3 sons, and there was a whole debate. They split up the kingdom. All these details, Eventually, the Romans instituted Romans instituted a procurator, and there would be only one other Jewish king in the land of Israel, a fellow by the name of Agrippas the First, and he's actually viewed very positively in Jewish literature. Because it seems like he was very loyal to the Jewish cause, the Jewish people, etc. As opposed to, he was a grandson of Herod. Herod had his 3 kids. One of them was named was Herod. That from the New Testament. I can't remember the names of all his kids. Either way, they didn't have that significant of impact on the nation. This guy Agrippas was Agrippas the First. He was in charge for a while. He obviously, because he was relatively good, he was executed. It happens all the time. Any good kings, it's not going to last. He was only king for 3 years, and then we meet, like I mentioned earlier, we meet individuals that were Romans who were the procurators of the land. Pontius Pilate, we mentioned. Florus, who was just a terrible, brutal, and really unskilled administrator. And under his leadership, we're going to see he's going to incite the people to revolt. He was a feckless leader, and he basically wanted to cover the tracks of his inadequacy by just slaughtering all the Jews, due to the tremendous. He's basically going to incite them to revolt. That's what Florus did.
We need to sort of.
We have 3 more minutes here. I'm trying to figure out how I'm going to finish this.
Okay. Well, we can just take it from there if you want. So I know you wanted to talk about the next.
Well, next week.
Classes, the
Yes,
classes.
different groups.
Subjects that we want to do before.
Oh, yeah. So let's stop here. What we're going to start next week. We're going to start from. We have another week of another history. We'll start from the Great Revolt in the year 66, and obviously culminating in the destruction of the Temple in the year 70. We'll talk about the different factors, different factions that exist among the people. We already talked about them a little bit. We talked about the Sadducees and the Hellenized Jews and the Pharisees and all that internal discord. We'll talk about that. We'll start from there next week.
You guys have we're working on the curriculum for the first quarter.